I gave 4 lectures on economic anthropology in the Michaelmas term to first-year undergraduates in Cambridge, and they seem to have been well appreciated. So I thought, since I'm only doing it once, I might record the lectures roughly as I gave them, but obviously slightly differently from the notes that I made at the time. The 4 lectures are divided into the 4 main theoretical ways in which you can approach economic anthropology. The 18th century approach basically was concerned with how you produce wealth. This is the classical economic approach of Adam Smith and others. How do you produce wealth? What are the stages of the modes of production of wealth? The 19th century was characteristically concerned with the distribution of wealth and the relations of production, property and such matters, famously in the Marxist theory. The 20th century was largely concerned with the nature of exchange of wealth and how gifts were given and money and markets worked. And the end of the century and the beginning of the 21st is concerned with the nature of the consumption of wealth and technologies and how they work. So those will be the 4 talks that I'll try and give now. So the first one is concerned with the production of wealth. And I will divide it in the way that the 18th century divided it, that is, into modes of production of wealth, into the 4 classic modes, that is, hunters and gatherers, tribal peoples, peasants, and industrial capitalist societies. So starting with hunters and gatherers. Hunters and gatherers have constituted over 90% of the world's population, not because there were terribly many of them, but because they were the only form of activity really for 100,000 years or so. And although there are now only perhaps 250,000 at the most of them, there were long periods when they were very, very important. They were pushed to marginal areas about 10,000 years ago, and they now live in the deserts and the Arctic tundra and forests and so on, true hunters and gatherers, and there are not many of them. Here are 1 or 2 features of them in relation to the way they produce wealth. There are 2 main kinds of hunter-gatherers described, differentiated by James Woodburn. The immediate return, that is, little storage, much exchange and sharing and reciprocity. You go out, you hunt something, you kill it, you share it among your friends and family, and that's it, you eat it straight away. All hunters and gatherers extract their food from nature, in other words, harvest nature, rather than cultivating plants. Occasionally they have some pets, or they have a beehive which they know of, and so on. So basically they're skimming off the surface of nature, and in the immediate return societies they do this straight away. And in such societies men and women tend to forage separately, famously man the hunter and woman the gatherer, and most of the food, something like 70%, traditionally came from the women. Gathering was more productive, though hunting might be more exciting. People in that sort of society tended to live in small bands, 25, 30, 40 people like that, which were constantly changing their composition and constantly moving around. And they had very little private property, except in certain tools, perhaps a little bit of clothing, a few ornaments, amulets and the like. And there were no real individual rights in land or property, though I'll come back to the way there were sort of property rights later. The great important thing was sharing food, and this provided a buffer against difficulties. And the campsite was a place of generalized exchange, where if someone was fortunate one day, they shared with their friends who might be fortunate the next day. And these were societies which were very lightly populated, and they controlled their fertility. They tended to suckle their children for quite a long time, and for that and other reasons they didn't appear to have very high birth rates. and the population density was seldom more than about 1 person per square mile. That was the first major form of production, hunting and gathering across the landscape. The second main form were tribesmen, tribal peoples. The transition from the Paleolithic, that is hunting and gathering, to the Neolithic, the food producers, occurred, well, there are big debates about it, let's say about 10,000 years ago, although there are signs of tribal societies going back much earlier than that. No one really knows why this great change occurred, why people started to interfere with nature, so to speak, to produce wealth. And it is one of the two great changes in productive systems, that is from hunting and gathering to domestication, the second being the Industrial Revolution more recently. The basic feature of tribal societies is that they produce food rather than just harvesting it. There are two main ways of doing this: through domesticating crops, grains and so on, and through domesticating animals. So you have horticulturalists and pastoralists. Often, of course, the two overlap. For instance, in New Guinea, you have both keeping of pigs and also the production of yams and other foodstuffs. But for general purposes, we can differentiate these two major forms of tribal society in production. What are the general features of tribal societies? Well, they still live in a fairly scattered way. There's still relatively light work. In the hunting and gathering society, you hunt and gather occasionally, but on the whole you only work a few hours a week at the most. And with tribal societies you work very hard at certain times, but there are long periods of leisure and ritual. But you're beginning to get permanent settlements rather than wandering around as the hunting and gathering peoples tended to do. You live in permanent settlements, which may move every 7 or 8 years as you burn down the forest, and you may move with your animals, but the settlement's much more permanent. And there are new divisions of labour. There are some specialist crafts in these societies, such as spinning, pottery, metalwork and so on, occur occasionally. A good description of what tribal society is about is given by the anthropologist Marshall Salins, who says that the term tribe is like the nation, a body of people of common derivation and custom, in possession and control of their own extensive territory. A tribe is specifically unlike a modern nation in that its several communities are not united under a sovereign governing authority, nor are the boundaries of the whole thus clearly and politically determined. The tribe builds itself up from within, the smaller community segments joined in groups of higher order. The tribe is also uncomplicated in another way. Its economics, its politics, its religion are not conducted by different institutions specially designed for the purpose, but coincidentally by the same kinship and local groups. Such a general formation, at once structurally decentralized and functionally generalized, is a primitive segmentary society. So tribal societies tend to be dominated by kinship and by ritual, as I saw, for instance, when I worked in a tribal society in the Himalayas in Nepal. For, as Salins says, in tribes, production, polity, that's the political system, and piety, the religious system, are not yet separately organized, and society not as yet a holy alliance of market, state and church as you find in peasant societies. He says Western culture, with its differentiation of kinship, politics, religion and economics, does not properly equip us to understand a tribal segmentary order. So there are major types of these societies. There's the forest-dwelling societies and the pastoral desert or open savanna-dwelling societies. The pastoral nomads, as they're often called, people who wander around, are famous in Manchuria, Mongolia, Tibet, Turkestan, Iran, Arabia, the Sahara. they travel around following their animals and cultivating animals. Then there are hunting, fishing and gathering tribes who are just in between hunters and gatherers and tribesmen. For example, the Northwest American Indians and the great equestrian hunters, the people on horseback in central North America, the Sioux, the Cheyenne, the Comanche and so on. So let's just go into these two types a little more and see how they produce wealth. The horticulturalists first. They tend to produce wealth by shifting cultivation methods, which is called swidden, S-W-I-D-D-E-N, a Yorkshire term, which means burning, slashing and burning down the countryside and using the nutrient from the burnt vegetation to help with the growth of the crops. They work on a cycle of clearing and then burning and then planting. Villages tend to move from place to place, and these societies are very productive. They produce huge surpluses of wealth. It's a very efficient way, not a huge amount of labour, and the burnt vegetation produces large crops, so you have huge exchanges going on, which I'll talk about later. And you have lots of different crops, all in different parts of the ecosystem. Often you grow some crops on the ground, some little climbing up the trees, some higher up in the trees. So it's often a vertical system of agriculture rather than just a horizontal one in flat fields. And the productivity per man hour is very high. As the cycles get shorter, though, and the system is affected by population growth, often you have to work harder and you settle down, and this evolves later into peasants. As for pastoralists, they keep all sorts of different kinds of livestock, of course, cattle, sheep, goats, horses, camels, yak, reindeer, and so on. And these are particularly well adapted as a way of taking the energy out of grasslands, mountains, and semi-deserts. And that's where you find nomadic pastoralists. Among the main features of such groups are that there is a stronger division of labour. Men tend to herd the animals, which need to be guarded against marauders. The women tend to milk and do things around the camp settlement, and of course produce children, which is one of their main functions. In such societies, since the main form of wealth is animals, there's often a very great attachment to animals. The North African Dinka and Nuer people, for instance, D-I-N-K-A-N-U-E-R, are very attached to their cattle, which are their main source of wealth. Pastoral societies are seasonally nomadic. They move with their herds over large territories, and often they move in what's known as transhumance, that is from one area to another, from highlands to lowlands, as you find, for instance, in the Himalayas and elsewhere. As the weather changes, you go up to the high pastures and then you come down again. Again, the settlement patterns are quite fluid, with people joining and leaving. Because you're mainly subsisting off animals, which have converted the grass or other fodder into something useful, the animals themselves produce a lot of protein, so these are very protein-rich societies, with a lot of consumption of meat, milk, and sometimes blood. The fundamental characteristic, we're told, of pastoralism is the recognition of living animals as a kind of self-reproducing property. And often, since the organization of production is through male groups, you have age groups of males who herd the animals, as in East Africa. These societies tend also to be quite warlike. There's a lot of feuding, raiding, both in the societies based on animals, where you have famous feuding societies, and also in the tribal societies, where you often have a lot of inter-tribal warfare going on, feuds of various kinds. The next major production system are what is known as peasants, a word that comes from the French paysan. Peasants again, it's difficult to precisely date them, but they roughly date from, say, about 5,000 years ago, 5 or 6,000 years ago, 3 or 4,000 BC. They started more or less simultaneously in China and in the Middle East, and there are signs, of course, of peasant societies well before even that. The Oxford English Dictionary defines a peasant as one who lives in the country and works on the land, either as a small farmer or as a labourer, a countryman, a rustic. And Raymond Firth, F-I-R-T-H, the economic anthropologist, has defined them as, by a peasant economy, one means a system of small-scale producers with a simple technology and equipment, often relying primarily for their subsistence on what they themselves produce. The primary means of livelihood of the peasant is the cultivation of the soil. Robert Redfield, another famous anthropologist, R-E-D-F-I-E-L-D, says, the culture of a peasant community, on the other hand, is not autonomous. It is an aspect of the civilization of which it is a part. As the peasant society is a half society, so the peasant culture is a half culture. And that's very important. Peasants can't exist just on their own. They exist in relation to urban societies, to cities, to rulers, to literate peoples. They are part societies. They are part of a wider civilization. Daniel Thorner, Thorner, one of the great students of peasant societies, defined 4 characteristics which peasants exhibited. If you're talking about peasants, you tend to talk about a society where, firstly, more than half the population are engaged in agriculture. Once that stops happening, you move to something else. Secondly, a peasantry can only exist if there is a state, some larger political organization. Thirdly, almost inevitably towns with markets with a different culture to the countryside exist. And finally, and this is important, our next and final criterion, the most fundamental, is that of the unit of production, what produces. In our concept of peasant economy, he says, the typical and most representative units of production are the peasant family household. So the people who produce are no longer tribal groups or hunting bands, but a household. And this has given rise to the term the domestic, or that is another word for household, the domestic mode of production. Parents and their children, often brothers working together, are the basic unit of production, and they tend to be the basic unit of consumption, and that is the characteristic of a peasant society. So that's one of the characteristics associated with peasantry. The basic unit of production is the extended household rather than the tribe. Secondly, the basic unit of consumption is the extended household. Thirdly, there tends to be a very strong link. These are now societies in which the household has a strong attachment to the family land. This is their land, and they know it's their main source of livelihood, and they want to maintain relations with it, a strong emotional link to the land. Villages in peasant societies tend to be almost entirely self-sufficient, and production within that peasant household is mainly for immediate use. You consume most of what you produce, although you may sell little bits of surpluses. And there is within these village communities or the villages little market rationality. That is, you're not thinking in terms of how much will this make in terms of selling it on the market. Production is not mainly for exchange but for consumption. There is no individual inheritance of land. Land belongs to the family and not to the individual. There's an ideal of a multi-generational grandparents, parents, children, and a complex household with brothers and sisters working together. The fertility rate in these societies tends traditionally to be high now, and the population grows in normal years, although it's often cut back by disasters. There's little geographical mobility, except in times of dire distress. So you tend to be born, marry and die in one community unless you're a woman and you marry into a neighbouring one. These are part societies in relation to wider units, political units, the state, and economic units, the market. And the people who live in the peasant villages tend to be illiterate in relation to a small literate group living further away. So that's the main characteristics of production in the great period of peasant societies, which lasted roughly from about 3,000 or 4,000 BC until about 1800 AD. Most of the world was peasant between those periods, and we've only evolved and moved into the last stage, I'll consider, in the last 200 or 300 years, and in places like India and China only in the last 50 or 60 years. So what is this last major stage? It's what we call industrial societies. The industrial societies, which are the ones most of us are familiar with, have four major ingredients within them. They're split into two major types, what are called capitalist societies, which I'll describe, and communist societies. And now there are many hybrids halfway between them, like China. So what are the major features of these societies? Well, firstly, they are technologically now very different from peasant societies. There is a new source of power, namely the stored energy from the sun. Fossil fuels, especially coal and then oil, give the energy for these societies. Peasant societies live, as their forebears had done in tribal societies, off the energy of the sun mediated through animals and plants. We now live off the fossil fuels mainly that have laid down the energy of the sun for millions of years. So industrial societies live off a new form of energy. And secondly, they organize labour in a new way, with a new, more what they consider to be rational organization, more division of labour, that is through systems such as factory production, where jobs are split into little bits and different people work together to produce a product. And thirdly, they tend now not to live in the countryside. Urbanism has grown. Cities are the main place where people live, and you have a new style of life, a new density of population. They're much, much denser populations, and you have urban industrial societies. So let's look a little more closely at their economic organization. In the capitalist form, there is a concentration of wealth into fewer and fewer hands. A second feature is a widespread use of money and market principles, selling and buying. An almost complete domination of economic life by money. And in capitalist societies, a fully privatized system of property and free inheritance, so individuals rather than families can own and inherit property. Machinery replaces human labour because it's the machinery that turns the energy into something we can use. And you have urbanization and a specialization of labour. These societies are also characterized by high social mobility. People move up and down the social hierarchy, and a good deal of geographical mobility. People are born in one place, move into another, move to a third, and so on. Max Weber, W-E-B-E-R, is one of the great sociologists of this form, and he has given certain central characteristics of industrial capitalist societies as follows. There's a separation of the business from the household, which completely dominates modern economic life. The peasantry were a domestic mode of production. You produced and consumed within the household. Now you live in one place in your household and you go off and work somewhere else, though of course now with computers that is tending to break down somewhat. There is the destruction of the domestic mode of production and the growing separation of public and private domains in politics, economics and social life. There's the growth, he says, of rational accounting. Everything is done in terms of balances, of probable profitableness of things. Will this make profit rather than can I feed my family? And under capitalism, there's a constant stress on accumulation, on saving, on profit-seeking, which has become ethically and emotionally attractive rather than distributing, which was what you tended to do in hunter-gatherer, tribal and other societies. You made wealth so that you could invest it in other people, give it away. In capitalist societies, you try and save a good deal of it. As he puts it, man is dominated by the making of money, by acquisition as the ultimate purpose of his life. Economic acquisition is no longer subordinated to man as the means for the satisfaction of his material needs. This reversal of what we should call the natural relationship is evidently as definitely a leading principle of capitalism as it is foreign to all peoples not under capitalist influences. This is the great shift in the world, in the industrial societies. You acquire, you make, you save, you accumulate. And in order to do that, you not only have a new economic system, but a new political and legal system. You need an underpinning of a calculating and calculable legal system. For capitalist industrial endeavour to succeed, as he says, you must be able to depend upon the legal system to protect individual property and sanctity of property and transactions and agreements and exchanges. So you need a new administrative legal system. And you need a new attitude towards nature. What Max Weber, adopting the phrase, called the disenchantment of the world. The world is now a means to an end. It's not enchanted. It doesn't have certain innate properties which you have to carefully guard. You use nature to produce wealth. And a new political organization arises, the nation state, not just the state which would safeguard you, but a new national and nationalism. And you have accompanying this new communications and intellectual organizations, new technologies of communication such as physical communication, trains, roads, steam power and so on, telegraphs, money, computers, clocks, telephones, all come together to produce a new technology and a new infrastructure to make industrialism possible. So those are the main forms of production which the 18th century had drawn attention through Adam Smith and other workers to the first three, to the tribal, or the hunter-gatherer, the tribal and the peasant, and even to a commercial society, as Smith called it. But by the end of the 18th century, industrial society was just on the horizon. We now have a fourth, which is not just commercial but industrial. So let's summarize the conclusions of the four main types for this lecture. Firstly, there's hunters and gatherers, which are of two types, both of whom harvest nature, but then have differences depending on their storage strategies. The direct return ones and the delayed return ones. Furthermore, there are considerable differences between the kinds of harvesting, hence there are fishing communities or fisher-gatherers who are different from forest gatherers, who are different again from desert gatherers. And the different continents produce very different kinds of hunters and gatherers. The Australian hunters and gatherers are very different from the Africans on the whole. But basically, these are all within the term of hunter-gatherer societies. Tribesmen all use plants and animals after having domesticated them. And the two main types, again, depend on the ecology. There are the forest dwellers, those who slash and burn swidden people, mainly in the Pacific, in South America, in Central Africa and Southeast Asia, in the great forest belts of those societies. And then there are the pastoral nomads, particularly in the Great Belt from North Africa through the Middle East and up into the whole of Central Asia. The next main stage are or one shouldn't think of stages, but different types, are the peasants, who now use more sophisticated technologies of production, settled agriculture with ploughs, advanced crafts, cities and writing. And they are basically of two types. There are the really serious, what one might call the real peasants of India, China, Mexico, the Mediterranean, with all the features that I've described and are described in the book by Eric Wolf, W-O-L-F, called Peasants. And then there are the rather peculiar agriculturalists, the sort of half-peasants or non-peasants but agricultural-based civilizations of England, Holland, early North America, early North Australia and so on, and to a certain extent Scandinavia, very individualistic kinds of half-peasants. And finally there are the industrial societies, which are all based on two features: the conversion of the energy of the sun through carbon energy, and then oil, more recently, using up the locked up treasures of the earth over a long period, thanks to the discovery of steam and the development of machinery, which both allow efficient energy conversion, and combined with this, an increasing division of labor, which increases production, and increasing the application of scientific knowledge to productive processes, which make them more efficient. And there are two major forms of industrial societies which existed fully in the 20th century but have come together to much more at the end of the century, basically to do with property. In one, there is the individualism of the quasi-peasants that I talked about, which have come and developed into capitalism. And in the other, there is the communalism of the pre-peasant worlds, which in Russia and China developed into, and certain other places developed into communism, where all property was theoretically owned communally and by the state. In the next three, I'll move on from this 18th century production framework to look at the 19th and 20th and 21st century frameworks of the distribution of property, the exchange or distribution of wealth, the exchange of wealth and the consumption of wealth.